Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we wander into a world of white columns, muddy yards, creaking wagons, and cotton fields that look almost peaceful in the moonlight, until you notice who is missing from that pretty picture and who was never allowed to leave it. You may have heard plenty about daring escapes, secret routes, and midnight flights north. But what happens when your body is watched? Your children are used as chains, and every road seems designed to return you to the same gate by dawn to night. You step into the daily reality of black women in the slave South, where captivity did not only sit in iron shackles or locked doors, but in law, labour, hunger, and the hands of people who believed they owned every hour of your life. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights, and you stand at the edge of a southern plantation before sunrise. When the air feels cool for a few precious minutes, and the sky still holds a faint blue hush above the trees, the yard smells of damp earth, wood smoke, and old livestock. Somewhere a rooster stirs into noise, thin at first, then sharp enough to cut the quiet. A cabin door opens. Bare feet meet packed dirt. A woman wraps cloth around her head and steps into the morning before the sun has even asked permission to rise. You follow her with your mind because this is where the story really begins. Not in dramatic escapes or whispered maps, but in the ordinary trap of waking up owned. That is the first hard truth. For black women on southern plantations, bondage was not only a place, it was a condition stitched into every task, every relationship, every mile of surrounding land. You could not simply decide to go. The plantation was built to make that decision almost useless. In legal terms, enslaved women were property, cold words, brutal meaning. Courts in slave states recognized them as assets that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, inherited, or seized over debt. A white planter might speak of duty, civilization, and Christian order on a Sunday morning, then list a woman beside mules and tools in an estate inventory by afternoon. There was no contradiction in his mind. That is what made the system so durable. It did not pretend she belonged to herself. You can almost hear the scratch of a clerk's pen as names are entered in ledgers. Sometimes no surname. Sometimes no age exactly right. Sometimes not even a full name at all. Just a first name with a price beside it. One mainstream fact remains painfully clear. In records across the South, enslaved women were essential to plantation wealth, not marginal to it. They worked in fields, kitchens, dairies, washhouses, gardens, spinning rooms, and nurseries. The fantasy that black women were somehow spared the harshest labour because they were women was mostly that, a fantasy. On many plantations, they chopped weeds, planted seed, hoed long rows, hauled water, cooked for large households, washed heavy linens by hand, and still cared for children after dark. The body was expected to keep giving. That expectation sat over everything like summer heat, and heat does arrive. As morning grows, you feel it gather on your skin. The cool edge of dawn disappears. Sun presses down on your head and shoulders. Cotton leaves rasp against your hands. In low country rice regions, the wet ground sucks at your ankles. In tobacco country, the plants leave a bitter green smell on the air. In sugar districts farther south, labour turns even more punishing, dense with steam, mud, insects, and machinery. Different crops, same logic. Work until the body bends around the demand. Historians still argue over the degree to which some plantations divided labour strictly by sex, because the records often describe work in broad categories, and planters like to flatter themselves as practical men rather than cruel ones. But the surviving testimony leaves very little room for comfort. Black women could be expected to do what needed doing, and what needed doing was often endless. The legal cage spread far beyond the fields. You could not lawfully marry in a way the state was bound to protect. You could form a family, love deeply, share vows before your community, but white law did not have to honour any of it. That meant husbands could be sold, children could be sold, mothers could be sold. Your most intimate bonds were allowed only so long as they suited an owner's convenience. Imagine trying to plan an escape when tomorrow your child might be sent 20 miles away, or 2 states away, or nowhere at all because the threat alone was enough. Threat was a daily tool, or it saved the plantation class time. You walk now toward the big house, where the boards are cleaner and the shadows fall differently under a porch roof. The contrast matters. Plantation landscapes were arranged to display power. The owner's house often sat where it could be seen. The quarters sat where they could be watched. Paths linked workspaces with a cruel efficiency. Smokehouses, barns, kitchens, dairy rooms, loom sheds, all part of a system. Even beauty had a job to do. Flowering trees by the lane, polished silver inside, curtains lifting in a soft breeze. These things tried to make domination look orderly. Aesthetic oppression, you might say, if you were feeling a little dry and sarcastic at bedtime. Slavery loved good landscaping. It made theft look refined. But for black women, the plantation was not just watched from above. It reached inside the body. Enslaved women lived under pressure as labourers and as reproducers of wealth. Children born to them inherited enslaved status under the principle known as partis sequitur ventrum, a rule tying a child's condition to that of the mother. That one doctrine gave slaveholders an obscene incentive to control black women's fertility, sexuality, and movement. If a woman had children, those children increased an owner's future property. There it is again. The law quietly doing violence while pretending to be paperwork. You feel the horror more fully when you picture its practical effect. A woman could not flee as an abstract individual in the way romantic stories often imagine. She might be pregnant. She might be nursing. She might have 3 children sleeping beside her. She might have an elderly mother in the next cabin. She might know that any attempt to run would bring punishment not only to herself, but to those people too. That does not mean black women lacked courage. It means courage had to answer to reality. Some people did run, of course. Women absolutely attempted escape. Sometimes alone, sometimes with children, sometimes with men, sometimes through temporary flight into woods or nearby towns rather than long journeys north. But the odds were sharpened against them by conditions that white observers often ignored. Clothing could hinder speed. Infants cried. Food was hard to carry. Safe hiding places were scarce. Patrols noticed women travelling alone because respectable southern society had rigid ideas about who should be on a road and why. The very gender codes that claimed women needed protection often exposed black women to more scrutiny. Since they were denied the protections and marked by the scrutiny, there is a strange little detail from plantation life that turns up often enough to linger in the mind shoes, or rather, the lack of reliable shoes. Many enslaved people received coarse, limited clothing distributions, sometimes only seasonally. A pair of badly fitted shoes, or none worth speaking of, could make a long journey miserable before it truly began. It sounds almost too small to matter, yet history is packed with small tyrannies. A blister can stop a person as surely as a locked gate. Sleepy little detail, deadly serious consequence. By noon, the plantation sounds change. Insects thicken in the air. A distant hammer strikes somewhere near a repair shed. A child cries, then goes quiet. Someone coughs from deep in the chest. The smell of boiling food drifts briefly from a detached kitchen and vanishes into heat. Sweat dries into salt on cloth. Dust clings to calves and hems. This physical world matters because escape is always about the body. Romantic memory turns it into symbols. Real life drags through mud. You stand in the quarters at evening now, when the light goes copper and then grey. A kettle simmers. Smoke curls low. Voices stay careful because walls are thin and ears are everywhere. Black women often built social worlds under these conditions. Worlds of care, warning, humour, song, herbal knowledge, prayer, and mutual aid. None of that erased captivity, but it made life livable enough to be endured, and endurance itself could become a form of resistance. One woman might share food, another might watch a child while someone laboured, another might pass news between plantations. In some communities, women carried remarkable botanical knowledge, using roots, leaves, teas, and poultices to treat illness when formal medical care meant indifference or experimentation. Planters benefited from that labour too, naturally. They had a gift for taking even survival and calling it management. There was also the matter of white women, whose role in this world was hardly passive. Plantation mistresses sometimes portrayed themselves later as delicate figures floating above cruelty, imprisoned by men and furniture. Convenient story. In reality, many supervised domestic labour, issued punishments, controlled food and clothing allotments, monitored pregnancies, and enforced discipline within household spaces. Black women in the house might face constant inspection, impossible standards, and intimate humiliation. A field hand could be whipped in public, a house servant could be pinched by scrutiny all day long. Different theatre, same violence. Scholars continue to debate how much leverage enslaved women could exercise within households through skill, negotiation, or emotional knowledge of the family they served. The answer seems to vary sharply by place and person. Some won tiny concessions, some manoeuvred for moments of privacy, some used assigned mobility to exchange information, yet none of that changed the underlying reality. Any privilege could vanish with a mood, a sale, a death, a debt, or a rumour, and rumour travelled fast. On plantations, information moved in curious ways. A driver might know more than he let on. A cook heard things from the porch. A laundress handled garments that carried traces of travel and gossip. A child trailing adults might notice what no one else did. One quirky tidbit that slips through the archive is how frequently animals appear in recollections of surveillance. Dogs, especially, were not just creatures in the background. Their barking signalled movement, their scenting could expose someone hiding. Even a restless horse in a stable could reveal late-night activity. The plantation listened with more than human ears. Night finally settles, but darkness does not equal freedom. You might think night would open the world. Sometimes it did. More often it narrowed it. Roads became dangerous. Swamps hid snakes, roots, and water channels. Strange lights in the distance could mean a cabin or a trap. Patrols moved with authority. A woman travelling alone risked capture, assault, or false kindness followed by betrayal. Southern space was deceptive that way. Wide land, almost no escape. Still, the mind reaches outward. It has to. You imagine the stars overhead, steady and indifferent, while beneath them a woman weighs impossible choices. Stay and protect a child for one more day. Flee and risk losing all of them at once. Trust a stranger. Trust no one. Carry food and be slowed down. Carry nothing and starve. Move at night and stumble. Move by day and be seen. There is no neat heroic script here, just pressure from every direction. That is why the phrase no escape means more than failed flight. It means structures closing around a person until every option extracts a cost she did not choose. Southern plantations held black women through labour demands, legal rules, sexual vulnerability, family dependence, surveillance, and geography all at once. Remove one barrier and 5 remained. It was a system built with backups. Yet even in that suffocating design, the humanity of black women refused to disappear. You hear it in low conversation near the cabin door. You notice it in the careful wrapping of a child against cool night air. You see it in hands braiding hair by firelight, in a shared crust of bread, in a look that says I know exactly what this world is, and I am still here, not broken into silence, not reduced to an entry in a ledger, present, thinking, enduring. The plantation wanted obedience to feel natural, permanent, even holy. It wanted black women to appear fixed in place, as rooted as the cotton itself. But human beings are not crops. They think, judge, resent, hope, remember. And when a system fears that inner life, it multiplies fences, laws, punishments, and lies. That fear tells you everything. The slave South knew exactly how fragile its order really was. Why else spend so much energy trapping people who never consented to stay? So you let the night grow quiet now. Crickets take over the soundscape. The smell of smoke softens. The packed earth releases the day's heat a little at a time. In one cabin, someone hums under her breath. In another, a mother curls around a sleeping child. Overhead, the dark stretches wide enough to suggest freedom, but the ground below remains claimed by force. And there, in that painful contrast between open sky and closed life, you begin to understand why black women on southern plantations had almost no path out at all. You wake into the kind of darkness that is not restful at all, but thick, expectant, and already owned by someone else. The cabin is close with the smell of ashes, damp cloth, and breath. A baby shifts in sleep. Wood cracks softly in the dying fire. Outside, the yard is still black, though the sky has begun to loosen at the edges. Before birdsong fully arrives, before the first streak of pale light, labour is already waiting like a person at the door. For black women on southern plantations, the day was rarely divided into neat parts. Work in the fields did not replace work at home. House labour did not excuse outdoor labour. Childcare did not cancel either one. The tasks layered over one another until the hours lost all mercy. You did not finish. You merely moved from one burden to the next, hoping your body would continue to obey. A horn sound, or a bell, or a human voice sharpened by habit. However the summons comes, it cuts through sleep with the same message. Rise now. Move now. Belong now. You step into the cool dirt yard. The air carries the smell of wet ground and old smoke from the cook fire. Dew clings to weeds along the path. In some places, women hurry toward cotton rows with hose over their shoulders. In others, they head first to kitchens, dairies, wash spaces, or gardens. Plantation labour was never one simple scene repeated forever. It changed with crop, season, wealth, region, and the whims of the owner, yet the pattern remained brutally familiar. Black women were expected to be useful everywhere. That expectation was not accidental. Slaveholders frequently described enslaved women as reliable workers, especially in cotton agriculture, where large gangs laboured together under supervision. Women planted, hoed, chopped grass, picked cotton, and carried heavy sacks that scraped at the neck and shoulders. During picking season, speed mattered, weight mattered. Every pound could become a measure of discipline, an excuse for punishment, or a twisted point of pride for an owner boasting about efficiency. The body learned the rows intimately. You can picture them stretching out under the sun in long green lines, then white bursting lines later in the season. Beautiful from a distance in the way dangerous things often are. Cotton bolls look almost soft enough to trust. Then your fingers meet them. Dry husks bite at skin. Sharp points catch under nails. Hands toughen, crack, and sting. Fine fibres cling to sweat. By midday, your back aches from bending. By evening, your shoulders are hot with strain. By the end of harvest, the body feels borrowed and overused. Women in rice regions face different torment. Rice cultivation required dangerous, exhausting labour in wet environments, with standing water, mud, insects, and oppressive heat. In tobacco districts, there was constant stooping, lifting, worming, cutting, curing. On sugar plantations farther south, especially where cane processing took over harvest months, labour could become frantic and relentless because cut cane spoiled quickly. The crop dictated the pace, but owners dictated the consequences, and yet fieldwork was only one piece. That is what makes the trap harder to fully feel. When the rows ended for the day, another shift often began. Imagine the wash day. It arrives not as a tidy domestic scene, but as an ordeal. Water must be hauled in buckets that dig into your palms. Fires must be built underneath iron kettles. Clothing, bed linens, towels, and household fabrics for white families become soaking bundles of weight. Soap can be harsh on skin. Steam rises thick around your face. Wet cloth slaps against washboards or stones. Your wrists ache from wringing. Your fingers prune, then split. And because the plantation household values whiteness in fabric almost as much as whiteness in skin, the demand is impossible. Everything must be cleaner than conditions allow. There is a quiet cruelty in laundry. It looks ordinary. It destroys the body anyway. Then there is cooking, On large plantations, meals for owners and guests required planning, fuel, skill, and timing. A cook might rise earlier than nearly anyone else. Cornmeal, pork, molasses, greens, biscuits, coffee, gravy, broth, pastries on special occasions, preserved fruit. Whatever the household expected had to appear as if by magic. Of course it was not magic. It was female labour hidden behind swinging doors and detached kitchens hot enough to feel like furnaces in summer. Smoke stings the eyes, grease settles into cloth, knives flash, pots clatter, dogs hover hopefully near scraps. A mistress complains about seasoning while never once carrying the firewood. Household work carried its own hazards. White families often insisted on instant service. A child cries upstairs. A guest wants tea. A floor must be scrubbed before visitors arrive. Silver must gleam. Chamber pots must be emptied. Beds must be aired. Babies must be rocked. Chickens fed. Milk strained. Butter churned. Floors swept again because someone noticed a speck. For enslaved black women in domestic service, there was no clear line between labour and availability. You were expected not only to work, but to be interruptible forever. Some women moved between these worlds in the same week, or even the same day. A woman might be sent to the fields during planting and to the house during illness or company visits. She might nurse white children and then hurry back to tend her own. She might spin, sew, mend, carry water, fetch wood, mind infants, and still be counted as underperforming if one major task slipped. Scholars continue to debate how rigidly some plantations separated domestic and agricultural labour, because accounts vary across time and place. But there is no serious doubt that many black women were required to perform an exhausting range of jobs across multiple spaces, and inside that range sat one of the most bitter facts of all. Rest was often treated like theft. To sit too long could draw a glance. To slow down could bring rebuke. To protect an aching back could be interpreted as laziness. The language of slaveholders was full of complaints about idleness, though the people they accused were already doing the work that fed, clothed, and enriched the entire plantation. It takes a certain level of nerve to force women through 13 or 14 waking hours of labour, and then complain that they lack enthusiasm. Southern slavery never lacked nerve. Food did not necessarily restore what labour took. Rations could be limited, monotonous, or nutritionally thin. Cornmeal, pork, molasses. Perhaps some garden produce or fish if people managed to supplement. Women often stretched what they had with ingenuity, skill, and stolen moments of cultivation. Small garden plots, where allowed, could become precious sources of beans, greens, herbs, or sweet potatoes. Cooking after labour hours demanded more strength from bodies already depleted. Hunger was not always dramatic enough for a plantation ledger to notice. It might simply appear as ongoing weakness, dizziness, soreness that never leaves, or a child whose thin wrists tell a whole story without words. The sounds of the plantation shift as the day lengthens. In the fields, you hear hoes striking dirt with dull rhythm. In the yard, wagon wheels grind against ruts. Somewhere a baby fusses, then quiets under a low humming voice. In the kitchen yard, lids rattle on iron pots. Chickens peck among dropped grain. A white overseer clears his throat as though the air itself belongs to him. Even silence can feel supervised. And there is weather. Weather always enters the story because labour happened inside it. Sun burned the back of the neck until cloth stuck there. Rain-soaked skirts and petticoats until fabric dragged heavily at the legs. Winter cold numbed fingers before dawn. Wind drove dust into the eyes. Summer insects settled on sweat. Thunderstorms turned paths into slick clay. Still, work generally continued unless conditions became impossible for owners too. Nature did not pause exploitation, simply gave it more textures. One unusual detail preserved in scattered recollections is the importance of carrying methods. Women moved astonishing amounts of weight using buckets, baskets, bundles, tubs, and balanced loads. Some carried objects on the head with practiced steadiness, conserving arm strength. Others used cloth wraps, improvised slings, or repeated short trips when one heavy load would have been dangerous. Such techniques can seem like small, practical notes, but they reveal something larger. Black women developed intricate bodily knowledge to survive a labour system that constantly pressed them past ordinary human limits. Pregnancy offered little protection. In fact, it often exposed the cruelty of the regime more openly. Some owners reduced labour late in pregnancy, many did not. Testimonies describe women working deep into pregnancy, then returning to labour shortly after giving birth. The timeline could be brutally short. A mother might be expected back in the field while still healing, still bleeding, still nursing. There are records of infants left nearby in shade or under the care of elderly women or older children, with mothers allowed brief breaks to nurse if the overseer permitted it. Allowed. Even tenderness had to pass through somebody else's approval. You feel the ache in that sentence because it captures the plantation's deepest insult. It did not merely exploit labour, it invaded care itself. For mothers, the workday stretched beyond sight. After sunset, there could be mending to do, food to prepare, children to wash, elders to tend, clothing to patch, stories to tell softly in the dark, or simply a moment of trying to make frightened children sleep in a place that punished noise and weakness alike. Some women made brooms, nets, quilts, baskets, or small items after hours. Others cultivated tiny gardens by moonlight or in spare early moments, squeezing life from soil that was never truly theirs. Many had no spare energy left. Exhaustion could sit on the chest like weight. Sleep came in fragments. It could be broken by a crying infant, a late demand from the big house, sickness in the quarters, storms, fear of inspection, or the dread of what tomorrow required. Chronic fatigue was not just a symptom, it was part of control. A tired person has less room to plan, less chance to run, less strength to resist openly. That does not mean women stopped thinking. It means every thought had to push through a fog of overwork. Historians still disagree about how plantation accounting measured women's labour compared with men's, since some records listed tasks rather than total household contribution, while others ignored reproductive and care work almost entirely. That scholarly uncertainty matters because it reveals how archives can hide effort in plain sight. A man's field output might appear as a neat number. A woman's day, split among cotton picking, childcare, cooking, washing, and nursing, could vanish into categories that never admit the full total. The plantation benefited from that invisibility. It made exploitation seem smaller than it was. Even the rare moments described as leisure often had work folded into them. Gathering around a fire might include shelling peas, twisting thread, combing children's hair, or patching torn garments. Singing could steady the hands while tasks continued. Conversation might happen over chopping vegetables or cleaning fish. Community did not occur outside labour so much as inside it, woven through necessity like a thread through cloth. Black women created warmth in spaces designed to drain them, but that warmth was built with energy the system had already stolen. There is a bitter irony here. White Southerners often praised the labour of black women when it made plantation life comfortable, then insulted those same women as coarse, unfeminine, or naturally suited to hardship. The contradiction served a purpose. If a woman could perform crushing labour and still be described as uniquely fit for it, then her pain could be ignored as normal. Pseudoscience, racism, and everyday convenience joined hands very neatly on this point. Cruel ideas love being useful. As night settles, the plantation does not become gentle, it merely lowers its voice. Crickets begin, frogs call from wet places beyond the cabins, smoke from evening fires drifts sweet and bitter together. Your legs throb with the memory of standing. Your hands feel rough against a child's cheek. Fabric scratches tired skin. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs once, unexpectedly bright, and it startles the darkness for a second. Human life does that. It appears even where it is least invited, and still there is one more truth. Overwork was not just the background of slavery for black women, it was one of the main bars of the cage. Endless labour made bodies weaker, narrowed time, strained families, blurred days, and devoured the private space needed to imagine another life. When every sunrise arrived with orders and every evening ended in unfinished necessity, escape became more than dangerous. It became physically difficult to prepare for, mentally difficult to sustain, and morally difficult to risk when others depended on you for the little comfort you could still provide. So in the hush of this exhausted night, you understand the plantation not as a single workplace, but as a machine that converted women's strength into profit from dawn until far past dark. The roos, the kitchens, the wash kettles, the nursery corners, the water buckets, the churns, the garden patches, the mending by low firelight, all of it formed a net, not dramatic, not elegant, just constant. And constant pressure can hold a person almost as firmly as chains. You learn very quickly that a plantation does not need walls to feel sealed. It can be open land, wide sky, a lane curling past trees, distant fields fading into heat. It can look almost limitless from the wrong angle. But once you notice how many eyes belong to that landscape, the openness starts to feel like a trap designed by someone with a talent for irony. Morning begins with movement already being counted. A door opens, someone notices, a figure crosses the yard, someone notices, a bucket is lifted, a child is carried, a path is taken instead of another path, and all of it enters the little web of attention that keeps the place running. Surveillance on plantations was rarely a single dramatic thing. It was more often a constant low pressure made of glances, habits, reports, and expectations. For black women, that pressure could be especially tight because their lives crossed so many spaces. They worked where they could be seen by overseers, by mistresses, by drivers, by household children, by visiting neighbours, by patrols on nearby roads, even by enslaved people forced into positions of authority over others. It is hard to disappear when your labour is needed everywhere. You step into the yard at first light, and the air smells of wet clay, old smoke, and something sour from the livestock pen. A mule snorts, chickens scratch at the dirt. The trees along the lane drip with dew. From somewhere near the quarters comes the thin wail of an infant who does not care that the plantation prefers order before breakfast. Then a voice rises, stern and practiced, cutting through the dawn. Someone is late. Someone is missing. Someone is already being asked to account for a body that belongs, in the eyes of the law, to somebody else. That accounting began with head counts and work assignments, but it did not end there. Owners and overseers wanted to know who was sick, who was pregnant, who had kin nearby, who seemed discontented, who talked too much, who walked too slowly, who had a reputation for spirit. Spirit, of course, meant anything from intelligence to sorrow, to the refusal to grin on command. Plantations produced their own crude intelligence systems. Information moved downward through punishment and upward through spying. If a woman was thought likely to resist, even in small ways, her life could become more tightly watched. Some owners used written passes to control movement beyond the plantation. Without a pass, travel on roads could invite interrogation, capture, or violence. This mattered deeply for black women because movement that might have seemed ordinary for white people could be treated as suspicious for them. Going to visit a spouse on another plantation, carrying goods to market under instructions, attending a church gathering, seeing kin, fetching supplies, or moving between work sites all exposed a woman to scrutiny if she lacked written authorization. The pass was not merely paper, it was a temporary permission slip for existing in public space. You can almost feel the coarse fold of it in your palm, damp with sweat, knowing it may or may not protect you depending on the mood of the person who stops you. Even when women did hold passes for errands or labour, they were still vulnerable. Patrols were not delicate institutions, made up largely of white men empowered to stop, question, whip, and detain black people found off plantations. Patrols turned roads into extensions of plantation discipline. Their presence reminds you that slavery was not just enforced at the home plantation itself. It spread outward through county networks, local custom, and laws that invited ordinary white people to become hunters of movement. A woman on the road faced several dangers at once. She could be accused of lying about her destination. Her pass could be doubted. She could be delayed until her owner became suspicious of her absence. She could be assaulted by the very men claiming to inspect her status. That last part is crucial. Surveillance was never neutral. It carried threat in its pocket. On the plantation, visibility took different forms depending on where a woman laboured. In the fields, supervision could be collective and blunt. Rows made bodies legible. Pace could be compared. Talking could be noticed. A woman stopping to adjust a child on her hip or straighten an aching back could attract immediate criticism. In house service, the watching often became more intimate and less predictable. White women might inspect floors for dust, linens for spots, posture for signs of resentment, facial expression for anything they chose to interpret as insolence. A domestic worker could spend the day under the peculiar strain of being constantly near white people while never safe from them. That kind of watchfulness altered the body. You learn to move carefully, not too slow, not too quick. You keep your face composed. You lower your eyes when needed, but not so much that it appears theatrical. You listen while seeming not to listen. You stand ready before being called. You become fluent in tiny calibrations because the wrong look, wrong pause, wrong tone can tip a day toward punishment. There is a strange exhaustion in always being observable. Historians continue to debate how often enslaved people acted as informants against one another by choice, by coercion, or simply by passing along gossip without knowing what would be done with it. The evidence is uneven because betrayal rarely leaves a neat record with motives attached. But plantation life made secrecy difficult. Enslaved communities needed trust to survive, yet owners deliberately damaged that trust by rewarding information, spreading fear, and putting selected individuals in supervisory roles. For black women, this could mean never fully knowing whether a private complaint, a whispered plan, or a family sorrow might travel farther than intended. That uncertainty worked in favour of the system. You do not need perfect surveillance if people begin to assume they are always exposed, and exposure often came through dependence itself. A woman with children could not simply slip away unnoticed if her absence meant a child was left behind, crying, hungry, or suddenly unaccounted for. A woman caring for an elder or sharing a cabin with several others could not move in silence without affecting their lives too. Even obtaining food for a possible escape required visible actions. Saving scraps, drying provisions, hiding cloth, seeking directions, arranging a meeting, asking for news, all could attract attention. The plantation turned everyday dependency into a method of control. Needing others was natural. The system made it perilous. You hear this in the daily sounds around the quarters. A baby calling for its mother, a child asking where someone has gone, a pot lid lifted, footsteps shifting on packed earth, quiet voices at dusk. Every sound ties people together, warmly and painfully. That closeness sustained emotional life, yet it also made disappearance difficult. On a plantation, almost nobody moved without creating a ripple. Then there were the roads beyond the gate, where gender norms sharpened the danger in peculiar ways. Southern society liked to imagine white women as sheltered and dependent, but black women were denied the social protections attached to that ideal while still being judged through its expectations. A white man encountering a black woman alone on a road might read her presence as evidence of criminality, sexual availability, defiance, or all three. Respectability was a script written for white women and then weaponized against black women who were never allowed to perform it on equal terms. That meant even ordinary appearance could become evidence. A bundle might suggest theft. Mud on a hem might suggest wandering. A determined pace might look suspicious. Looking afraid could invite further aggression. Looking steady could be called insolence. The range of acceptable behaviour was tiny. The range of punishable interpretation was enormous. One curious detail tucked into scattered accounts is how often bells, horns, or other sound signals organised plantation time. These sounds did more than mark labour hours. They trained bodies to respond, reminded everyone that time itself belonged to the owner, and made irregular absence stand out. If the field bell rang and one woman was missing, the silence around that fact became loud. Timekeeping, in this sense, was part of surveillance. Even the hour could betray you. Some plantations also used architecture to increase visibility. Quarters might be arranged in rows facing a yard rather than tucked privately into woods. Paths might funnel movement past the big house or overseer's dwelling. Work areas were sometimes clustered for convenience and control. A lane lined with trees might look gracious to a visitor, while actually allowing clear observation of anyone coming or going. The South had a gift for making domination look scenic. You begin to understand how deeply this shaped thought. Escape requires more than desire. It requires time alone to think clearly, safe conversation, reliable information, confidence that one's absence will not instantly trigger search, and some sense of where safety might lie. Black women were often denied each ingredient. Information could be fragmentary. Solitude was rare. Search could begin quickly because women were economically valuable and socially embedded. Even planning in the mind became difficult under fatigue and scrutiny. Yet watched people do not stop seeing. That is one of the quiet reversals hidden in plantation life. Black women were observed constantly, but they also became expert observers themselves. You notice who drinks too much after sundown. You note which dogs bark at strangers and which can be soothed. You learn when the mistress naps, when the overseer rides out, which road patrols favour after rain, which white neighbour is less likely to ask questions, where the fence line dips, which child carries gossip home from the big house. Observation became a survival skill, a form of intelligence gathered under pressure. It could not cancel the power imbalance, but it could help women navigate it. Scholars still disagree over how much internal plantation knowledge directly supported escape attempts by women, because many failed flights were never recorded in detail, and successful fugitives often left only fragments behind. Some evidence suggests women used market days, hiring out arrangements, religious meetings, and kin networks to gain information. Other evidence suggests the danger of exposure was so high that many could not convert knowledge into movement. Both things can be true. Knowing the map is not the same as being able to walk it. In some places, white children formed part of the surveillance machinery without fully understanding it. They repeated overheard remarks, reported who had smiled or frowned, noticed who had stepped away, demanded service at odd moments, and carried stories between rooms. Their innocence, such as it was, offered no protection to the women compelled to serve them. A child's casual comment at supper could bring punishment by evening. That is one of slavery's ugliest talents. It taught even the young to participate in control before they could grasp the full shape of what they were doing. The smell of the day changes as the sun rises higher. Dust warms. Pine resin thickens in the heat. Sweat dries salty on skin. In the house yard, starch and soap drift from laundry kettles. Near the stable, hay and manure lift together in a heavy animal scent. All the while, people are measuring one another, not always with malice, sometimes with fear, sometimes with caution, sometimes with the weary precision of those who know that every motion matters. A woman who laughs too freely may be said to have forgotten her place. A woman who speaks little may be called sullen. A woman who keeps to herself may be suspected of plotting. A woman who seeks company may be accused of stirring unrest. The terms change, but the result is similar. There is almost no posture that cannot be turned against her if someone powerful wants a reason. You feel why this made open escape so difficult. The plantation did not rely only on chains, dogs, or armed men. It relied on habits of noticing. It relied on the fact that black women were woven into labour systems so tightly that any missing thread could be seen at once. It relied on social rules that made their movement legible and suspicious. It relied on family dependence that made absence audible. It relied on local white networks ready to stop anybody deemed out of place. In that world, stepping away was never just stepping away. And still, the inner life remained stubborn. A watched woman could still think beyond the horizon. She could still imagine a road not yet taken, a town not yet reached, a river not yet crossed. She could hold names in memory, measure risks, test silences, hide intentions under ordinary gestures. That private space mattered. Power wanted access to it, but could never fully secure it. Even the most scrutinized life kept corners of thought beyond easy reach. By evening, the plantation softens in appearance but not in purpose. Sunlight lowers into gold along fence rails. Frogs begin in the wet places. A cart rattles home. Smoke from cook fires drifts blue and fragrant over the quarters. The scene could almost pass for peace to someone determined not to look closely. But you know better now. You know the softness of dusk can coexist with a hard net of attention. You know a place can glow beautifully while giving nobody room to vanish. So when darkness settles and the lane fades into shadow, you do not mistake that darkness for cover. You understand how many eyes have already done their work before night arrives. You understand why black women on southern plantations were so often visible before they even chose to move. Why every errand could become inspection. Why every absence could become alarm. Why the dream of escape had to pass through a world that specialized in noticing them only as property. The sky may have been open. The watching was everywhere. Night has barely loosened its grip when you hear the small sounds that make a plantation cabin feel both tender and unbearable. A child breathing unevenly in sleep. An infant rooting in the dark. Cloth rustling as a mother shifts to soothe a warm little body against her own. The smell is close and human. Smoke in the blankets, milk on skin, a trace of damp earth drifting through the cracks. It is an intimate world. It should be a protected one. On a southern plantation, it is anything but for black women. Motherhood could bring joy, pride, wonder, and fierce attachment. It could also become one of the most powerful ways slavery held them in place. A child was never simply a child in the eyes of the plantation regime. A child could be leverage. A child could be profit. A child could be the reason a woman stayed when every part of her longed to run. You feel the cruelty most sharply in the first light of morning, when a mother must rise before her own body has recovered from sleep, before a baby is ready to be set down, before the cold air has left the floorboards. She lifts one child, nudges another awake, wraps cloth around herself, and tries to prepare for labour while tending to lives that depend on her completely. There is no gentle transition. Duty rushes in at once. A crying infant does not stop the field bell. A feverish child does not delay the overseer. Motherhood happened inside a system that treated care as inconvenience. That is one of slavery's bleakest contradictions. It depended on black women's ability to bear and raise children, yet it offered almost no security to the bond between mother and child. The law played a central role here. In slaveholding states, the status of a child followed the mother. If she was enslaved, her children were enslaved too. This rule turned birth into an economic event for slaveholders. Every newborn could be counted as future wealth, future labour, future collateral. A mother looking into her baby's face saw love, fear, and wonder. An owner might see an addition to his estate. The emotional gap between those two visions is almost impossible to overstate. You can picture a plantation ledger again, that dry little instrument of cruelty. Ages listed in years, then months, then perhaps only categories. Boy child, girl child, no memory of first smiles, no note about how a mother hummed to the baby by the fire. No mention of teething nights or tiny fingers clutching at her dress. Bureaucracy has a special gift for pretending tenderness does not exist. But tenderness did exist. It existed constantly. Black mothers worked to keep children alive in conditions structured against rest, nourishment, and safety. They fed them with scarce food, patched their clothes, braided their hair, watched for illness, and tried to carve out small islands of comfort in cabins that offered very little privacy. They told stories softly at night. They sang. They taught caution early because childhood under slavery could never be fully innocent. A child had to learn who might strike, who might inform, where not to wander, when to be still. Imagine teaching a little one how to survive before teaching them how to play freely. That is a heavy curriculum. Some mothers had older women nearby who helped with infants and small children while they worked. Grandmothers, aunts, older girls, neighbours in the quarters, all could become part of a caregiving web. These networks mattered deeply. Without them, many mothers could not have endured the day's demands at all. You sense their presence in the ordinary details. A toddler passed from one pair of hands to another. A baby carried on a hip by an older sister. A pot shared between cabins. A warning whispered when a child is too close to danger. Community softened the edges of plantation life where it could. Still, Even shared care could not erase the terror hanging over family life. Sale was always possible. Debt could rearrange lives with a signature. Inheritance could scatter siblings. A widow needing funds, a planter settling accounts, a trader riding in, a rumour of bad harvests. Any of these could push a family toward separation. Mothers lived with that knowledge not as abstract dread, but as an ordinary feature of the world around them. Every goodbye could become permanent. Every embrace carried uncertainty. Historians continue to debate how often enslaved mothers were able to influence the fate of their children through appeals, negotiation, or strategic displays of usefulness. In some cases, women seem to have begged successfully for a child to remain on the same plantation or delayed a sale for a time. In many others, no such leverage existed. The records are uneven because owners wrote down transactions more faithfully than tears. What remains certain is that maternal love was never legally secure. That insecurity shaped every thought about escape. A man running alone faced terrible danger. A mother with children faced multiplying danger at every step. Could she carry a baby far enough? Could older children remain quiet when patrols passed? Could she find enough food? What if one child fell sick on the road? What if she fled with some but had to leave another behind? What if an escape attempt failed and punishment fell on the whole family? There are no clean answers to questions like these. There is only the ache of having to ask them. This is where popular stories about escape can grow too simple. People love the image of a lone runaway under the stars, brave and swift, slipping through the dark toward freedom. That did happen. But motherhood made flight much harder. Children moved slowly, babies cried, little feet tired quickly. Fear made everything louder. Even deciding whether to attempt escape demanded a kind of moral arithmetic no one should ever have to perform. Stay and endure together for one more day, or risk losing each other all at once. The plantation understood that pressure very well. The morning grows warmer now. Dust lifts in the yard. Smoke rises from a cook fire and catches in your throat, somewhere nearby. A child whimpers with the thin impatience of hunger. A woman answers in a low murmur while tying up her headcloth with one hand and balancing a baby with the other. Her movements are practiced because they must be. There is no applause for such skill, only more demand. Pregnancy brought another layer of exposure. Some slaveholders wanted women to continue strenuous work deep into pregnancy, because labour was too valuable to reduce. Others adjusted duties late in term, not from kindness, but from concern for future property. That distinction matters. The body might receive temporary accommodation, but the motive was still possession. A pregnant woman could be watched with a peculiar mixture of indifference and investment. If she bent over in pain, someone might scold her for slowness. If she stumbled, someone might worry about the child for financial reasons. You cannot help noticing how grotesque that arrangement is. Birth itself often took place under strained conditions, attended by other black women with practical knowledge, rather than by physicians offering sustained care. Midwives, elder women, and experienced mothers carried crucial expertise about labour, herbs, comfort, and recovery. Their skill formed one of the quiet foundations of plantation survival. A quirky but revealing detail in many accounts is how much confidence communities placed in certain women known for birthing knowledge. Women who could judge labour's progress by touch, sound, and instinct more accurately than any owner ever could. Their authority was real, though seldom honoured in formal records. Yet recovery time could be painfully short. In some places, women were expected back at work soon after delivery, still weak, still healing, still adjusting to a new baby. A mother might leave an infant in the care of an older woman, then rush back during brief pauses to nurse if allowed. The separation could happen before body and mind were ready. Milk let down under stress, wounds lingered, sleep vanished. Imagine returning to the fields with your whole body pleading for stillness and your infant not far away. Crying in a cabin you cannot reach until someone permits it. That is not merely hardship. It is a forced severing of natural rhythms. Children themselves could also be used to discipline mothers. Threats did not always need to be carried out to be effective. A woman might be warned that disobedience could lead to her child's sale, harsher labour assignment, or physical punishment inflicted where the child could witness it. The plantation exploited emotion with precision. Love became a handle others could grab, and yet love also made women astonishingly resourceful. Mothers hid food. They stretched rations with garden produce, fish, roots, berries, or whatever could be found or traded. They stitched old cloth into usable garments. They invented games from scraps and sounds. They calmed frightened children with songs whose gentleness stands in painful contrast to the world around them. They passed down names, stories, habits of speech, and ways of carrying oneself that quietly resisted the plantation's effort to define a family only by ownership. You hear it in evening voices around the cabins, laughter from children who, for a moment, forget danger, a stern whisper telling one child not to wander near the lane, the tapping rhythm of a spoon against a pot, the scent of cornmeal cooking, mixed with wood smoke and tired bodies. The atmosphere is fragile, but alive. Motherhood here is not only sorrow, it is work, invention, discipline, warmth, fear, memory, and stubborn commitment. Some children were hired out, sent temporarily to other households or workplaces as they grew older. Others were put to labour astonishingly young, starting with errands, care tasks, scaring birds from fields, carrying water, or helping in kitchens. A mother watching this unfold had little power to stop it. Childhood shortened under slavery. The line between being cared for and being used could vanish early. A little girl carrying a baby on her hip might already be learning the motions that would define her own future. There is a sadness in that repetition, a kind of inheritance nobody chose. Scholars still disagree about how much emotional autonomy enslaved mothers could claim in raising children whose lives were so thoroughly constrained by owners. Some argue maternal authority remained significant within the quarters, especially in moral teaching and daily care. Others stress how often outside interference fractured that authority. Both views capture part of the truth. A mother could shape a child's inner life even when she could not secure the child's outer freedom. That distinction matters. It honours her work without romanticising her limits. There is another bitter irony in the way slaveholders sometimes congratulated themselves for not separating mothers and young children too soon, as though delaying one cruelty somehow softened the institution itself. Keeping a nursing child near its mother often served practical needs. It protected the child's value. It maintained the mother's labour capacity. It reduced immediate loss. Such calculations could masquerade as benevolence. Plantation paternalism was very fond of costumes. Afternoon settles heavy over the yard. The air smells of sun-baked wood, churned dirt, and boiling laundry. Flies gather where they are least wanted. A child's face is sticky with heat. A mother wipes it with the corner of her apron while moving. Always moving. That is the image that lingers. Not passivity, not helplessness. Motion under pressure. Care under pressure. Love under pressure. You begin to see why motherhood narrowed the already narrow space for escape. A woman without legal claim to her own children, without control over her time, without reliable protection on the road, without assurance of food or shelter beyond the plantation, could not treat flight as a purely personal decision. Every child altered the risk. Every attachment deepened the cost. Bondage did not merely hold her body in place. It wrapped itself around her responsibilities. As evening comes, the sky cools into lavender and grey. Frogs begin their wet little chorus beyond the cabins. Smoke drifts low and sweet from the fires. A baby finally sleeps, heavy and warm, against a mother's shoulder. Her own eyes burn with fatigue. Her hands are rough from labour. Her mind is still alert because mothers rarely get the luxury of collapsing completely. She listens for coughs, for footsteps, for trouble, for breathing. And in that dim light, with a child gathered close and tomorrow already pressing in, you understand something essential. Southern plantations trapped black women not only by force and law, but through the deepest human bond of all. Motherhood gave comfort, meaning, and fierce purpose. Slavery turned that same bond into a means of captivity. That is why escape could feel impossible, even when the desire for freedom burned bright enough to light the whole night sky. There are some kinds of danger a plantation displays openly, almost proudly. The whip cracking in daylight, the overseer on horseback, the auction block, the patrol on the road. Then there are the dangers that move more quietly, through bedrooms, passageways, kitchens after dark, shaded corners of the yard, errands that last too long, and doors that should never have opened at all. For black women in the slave South, violence did not end when the public labour was done. In many ways, that was when another layer of fear began to stir. You feel it in the evening atmosphere first. The heat of the day has broken just enough to make the air seem almost kind. Crickets pulse in the grass. Smoke rises in soft blue ribbons from the cabins. A pot simmers somewhere with the faint smell of cornmeal and greens. Children drift towards sleep in tired heaps. Across the yard, the big house glows with lamplight behind glass. It looks calm from a distance. That calm is a lie. For enslaved black women, exposure to sexual coercion was built into the system itself. The law offered little recognition of their bodily autonomy, and the customs of slave society made white men especially difficult to challenge. A woman could be summoned, cornered, threatened, bribed, punished, or assaulted by an owner, an overseer, a relative of the owner, a hired white employee, or another white man who understood perfectly well that her refusal might carry no legal weight. This was not a rare distortion of slavery. It was one of its most intimate cruelties. The plantation liked to dress itself in the language of order, morality, and Christian responsibility. It spoke loftily about purity while treating black women as available. It preached restraint while rewarding white male impunity. It praised feminine virtue while refusing to extend that category to the very women whose labour sustained the household. You almost have to admire the scale of the hypocrisy. In the same exhausted way one might admire a thunderstorm for its commitment. A black woman living under slavery could never safely assume that domestic space meant protection. A kitchen could become a place of trapping. A hallway could become a route of dread. A room in the big house, emptied for an afternoon or quiet after midnight, could turn from workplace to site of danger in a heartbeat. The same closeness that made house service seem less brutal to distant observers often increased a woman's vulnerability. Being near power did not make her safer, it made her more accessible. This is one reason the old romantic image of the sheltered house servant collapses so quickly when examined honestly. A woman inside the house might avoid some field labour, but she could be under constant inspection, constant interruption, and constant risk from those who believed the walls erased her right to refuse. Her body could be treated as part of the household inventory, no less than the linens she washed or the silver she polished. If she resisted, there might be punishment. If she submitted under threat, there might still be punishment, along with blame. That blame was one of slavery's ugliest inventions. White society often cast black women as naturally immoral, seductive, or coarse, then used those lies to excuse violence against them. The logic was vicious and convenient. If a woman was imagined to lack virtue, then harming her seemed less like a crime. If she was imagined to invite attention, then coercion could be described as consent. Racism and misogyny work together here with terrifying smoothness. You can hear the social machinery of it in whispered accusations, in jealous remarks from mistresses, in the clipped tone of a white woman who knows her husband's behaviour but chooses to direct her anger downward instead of upward. Plantation households were full of these crooked emotional arrangements. A mistress might resent an enslaved woman for attracting unwanted attention, or for bearing a child whose resemblance raised uncomfortable questions. Rather than confront the white man who held actual power, she might punish the woman through harsher work, reduced food, surveillance, humiliation, or physical violence. Domestic jealousy under slavery did not stay private. It became another tool of domination. Some of the sharpest pain in this history sits in what the archive barely names. Historians still argue over how fully sexual violence can be measured from plantation records, because the records were created by the people most invested in concealing or normalizing it. Pregnancies appear without explanation. Mixed-race children appear in inventories. Bitter remarks surface in letters. Testimonies collected later speak plainly at times. Yet many women had reasons not to tell everything, or not to tell it in ways white interviewers could easily hear. Silence in the sources does not mean safety in the past. More often, it means fear, stigma, or the ordinary impossibility of writing down what power had already erased. The silence itself becomes part of the story. Imagine a woman moving through the yard after sunset with an extra awareness in her shoulders, listening for footsteps that do not belong. The dirt is still warm beneath her bare feet. The smell of magnolia drifts faintly from somewhere near the lane. Frogs call from low wet ground. A screen door at the big house snaps shut. Every small sound sharpens. Not because night is mysterious, but because night creates cover for those who know they are unlikely to be challenged. Even women in the fields were not safe from this form of danger. Isolation could occur in broad daylight as easily as darkness. A woman sent to fetch water, gather wood, carry messages, clean a distant room, milk in an outbuilding, or tend to some separate task might find herself alone with a man whose authority rested on violence. The plantation did not need hidden chambers. It only needed unequal power and a world that would not believe her even if she spoke. Pregnancy resulting from assault could deepen a woman's vulnerability in several directions at once. It altered her workload, her health, her emotional state, and her standing within the plantation household. If the father was white, the child's appearance could trigger resentment, gossip, or uneasy recognition. Yet the law still followed the mother's status. The child remained enslaved. The system could absorb the evidence of its own abuse and turn it into more property. There are few facts in American history more chilling than that one, and still, black women were not passive figures drifting through violation without response. Some resisted directly, sometimes with astonishing courage. They fought back physically when they could. They avoided certain routes. They tried to stay near other women. They warned one another. They used illness as cover. They bargained for safer assignments. They cultivated alliances. They watched the moods of dangerous men with painful precision. Resistance could be loud, but often it had to be subtle, improvised, and immediate. Survival sometimes depended on reading a room before the room fully revealed itself. One curious detail that surfaces in bits of testimony is the use of layered clothing, head wraps, aprons, or work garments not only for labour, but as slight barriers of control and dignity. These were not magical protections, of course. Nothing in cloth could stop a determined attacker, yet the act of wrapping, pinning, fastening, and arranging the body on one's own terms could carry emotional significance. It was a daily assertion that the body belonged, at least in feeling, to the person inside it. Such gestures may seem small from a distance. Under coercion, small claims to self can matter enormously. There was danger too from the structure of sleeping arrangements. Cabins were crowded, but crowding did not always guarantee security. Family members or cabin mates could sometimes deter outsiders. At other times, they could not. House servants might be required to sleep in attics, side rooms, passages, or spaces close to those who held power over them. Hired out women, living away from familiar kin, could be especially exposed. To sleep in a place chosen by someone else, under rules set by someone else, with no secure lock and no legal defense, is a kind of vulnerability that settles into the bones. The emotional cost could be immense. Fear alters breathing, posture, appetite, sleep, trust. A woman subjected to ongoing coercion might seem withdrawn, irritable, numb, or suddenly angry. She might protect younger girls with fierce vigilance. She might avoid conversation. She might laugh too loudly because silence feels dangerous. Trauma does not arrive in tidy and dramatic speeches. It often appears in habits, in flinches, in the body's refusal to rest even when rest is finally possible. You begin to understand why this violence also restricted movement and escape. A woman facing sexual threat could not simply judge the plantation by the public order of work assignments. She had to calculate personal risk at every hour. Running away might expose her to predatory men on the road. Staying might expose her to predatory men at home. Seeking help from local whites could be impossible or dangerous. Even white women who recognized abuse might prefer denial, cruelty, or silence over any challenge to the system that protected their own status. The roads beyond the plantation were not innocent either. Patrols, strangers, jailers, and supposed helpers could pose similar threats. For black women, The world outside slavery was not automatically free of sexual danger. That is part of what made the choice so terrible. The route away from one threat could pass directly through another. Some women found fragile safety in female community. Other women noticed patterns, covered for one another, arranged shared sleeping spaces, distracted dangerous men, spread warnings, or tended to the sick and grieving afterward. Midwives and elder women sometimes held especially important roles here, not just in birth, but in practical care and emotional shelter. A hurt woman might be washed, comforted, or quietly advised by those who understood more than she had to say aloud. These networks could not eliminate violence, but they could reduce isolation. Under slavery, to be less alone was no small gift. Scholars continue to debate how often white women knowingly facilitated or merely ignored sexual coercion inside plantation households. The evidence reveals both patterns. Some mistresses clearly recognized what was happening and turned their hostility against the enslaved women involved. Others may have chosen not to name what they understood too well. A few seem to have intervened in limited ways, though usually without challenging the underlying system. Whatever their differences, the household remained structured around white authority and black vulnerability. That broad truth does not bend much. As the night deepens, the plantation grows quieter but not gentler. The smell of the fire sinks lower. A breeze stirs through the trees with a soft, dry hiss. Somewhere a child coughs in sleep, somewhere else. A floorboard creaks where nobody wants to hear it. You feel how fear can sharpen every little noise until the world seems made of warnings. And there is another wound here, one less visible but deeply cruel. Sexual violence under slavery attacked not only the body, but also reputation, intimacy, courtship, trust, and family bonds. A husband might be powerless to protect his wife. A wife might hide what happened to spare him anguish or prevent retaliation. Young girls growing toward womanhood would do so under the knowledge that beauty or maturity could attract dangerous attention rather than celebration. The very milestones of life became shadowed. That shadow reached into identity itself. White society kept insisting that black women were naturally strong enough to endure anything, naturally shameless enough to be violated without injury, naturally unworthy of the delicacy reserved for white womanhood. Those lies were useful because they transformed cruelty into common sense. They made suffering look expected. They made protest look unreasonable. But lies repeated 1,000 times do not become truth. They simply become tradition, which is sometimes even harder to fight. So when you stand in the dim edge of the quarters now, hearing the low murmur of women's voices through cabin walls and seeing the big house shine like a distant threat under the stars, you grasp why there was no easy refuge here. Not in the field, not in the kitchen, not in the nursery, not in the night. Southern plantations trapped black women through labour and law, yes, but also through this quieter violence that entered private space and made the body itself contested ground. The darkness settles around everything evenly, over porches and cabins, over fences and trees, over children asleep and women still listening. It would be comforting if darkness meant concealment. Often it did not. Often it only hid the face of what was coming, and that is the cruel knowledge you carry into the stillness now for black women on plantations. Danger was not always loud, but it was close. Very close. You step away from the cabins at dawn and look outward, past the kitchen yard, past the split-rail fences, past the furrows and tree lines, toward the land that seems to promise distance simply by existing. The horizon lies there in pale blue and silver, calm as a whispered invitation. A road bends away between pines. Mist hangs low over a creek. Somewhere beyond the fields, birds are calling from unseen branches, as if the world belongs to no one at all. It is a beautiful deception, because the geography of the slave South did not offer easy exits. It offered obstacles, disguises, false hopes, and punishing distances. For black women. Those obstacles were sharpened by the practical facts of daily life. A road was not merely a road, it was a place of recognition. A river was not merely water, it was current, mud, crossing, and risk. A swamp was not merely cover, it was insects, roots, fever, snakes, hunger, and slow movement. The landscape could hide you, but it could also consume you before freedom ever appeared. This matters more than people sometimes realise. Stories of escape often focus on courage and cleverness, which is fair enough, because both were necessary. But geography had its own vote in the matter. Southern plantations were often set in rural areas far from towns, courts, or any place where a fugitive woman could blend in easily. Even where distances were not enormous on paper, they became enormous on foot, in poor shoes, without enough food, under the strain of fear and fatigue. You feel that truth in the body first. The grass is wet with dew, your hem grows heavy, the air smells of damp soil and pine sap. Beneath your feet, the ground changes constantly. Packed dirt in one place, loose sand in another, sticky clay after rain, hard ruts where wagon wheels have cut the road. Every surface has a consequence. Sand slows you, clay clings, stones bruise, briars scratch your ankles. None of it sounds dramatic. That is exactly the problem. Escape could be undone not only by spectacular danger, but by the ordinary nastiness of southern terrain. For black women, clothing could become part of the difficulty. Dresses, petticoats, aprons, head wraps, shawls, coarse shoes if shoes were available at all. These were garments built for labour and modesty under surveillance, not for rapid flight across forests and marshes. Fabric snagged on branches, wet skirts dragged at the legs, bare feet toughened by work could still split on roots or rough gravel. A woman carrying an infant, food, or a small bundle of necessities would feel every mile twice. The body becomes a map of penalties. And then there are the waterways. In many parts of the south, rivers, creeks, and low wetlands threaded through plantation country like both lifelines and barriers. Water could provide direction. It could also trap. Deep crossings demanded strength, timing, and luck. Even shallow creeks could soak clothing, spoil food, chill the body, and leave clear tracks in muddy banks. Swamps offered concealment from searchers, but they also offered mosquitoes, stagnant water, tangled growth, sudden holes, and the very real possibility of getting lost in circles. White people told lurid stories about swamps as if nature itself had volunteered to defend slavery. Convenient superstition, really, but the danger was real enough without ghost stories. Historians still argue over how often fugitive women use swamp regions for temporary refuge rather than long-distance escape, because many disappearances were recorded only as absences, not as detailed narratives. Some women likely hid nearby for days or weeks, depending on local support networks and search intensity. Others seem to have tried for towns, ports, or routes leading toward free territory. The uncertainty tells you something important. Not all escape was a straight line toward freedom. Sometimes it was a pause in the woods, a shelter in a hidden camp, a desperate breathing space carved out of hostile terrain. The roads themselves posed their own trap. Roads connected plantations to markets, towns, courthouses, river landings, and neighbouring estates. That made them useful. It also made them watched. Wagons rattled along them. White travellers used them. Patrols moved on them. Anyone walking alone without a clear, approved reason could draw scrutiny. A black woman on a road was not invisible. She was often startlingly visible, especially if she appeared tired, out of place, or burdened with children. That burden matters deeply here. A mother attempting to travel with children faced geography in a different way from a lone adult. A mile that might challenge one person could exhaust a small child. A creek crossing could become impossible with an infant in arms. Night travel could require quiet that children simply could not maintain. Hunger came faster. Cold bit harder. Fear spread more quickly. Even deciding which route to take had moral weight. A safer path might be longer. A shorter path might pass more houses. A hidden route through woods might save you from people and deliver you straight into injury or disorientation. You can sense the land shifting with the day now. Sun burns away the mist. Insects begin their dry, buzzing chorus. The smell of warm grass rises. Pine woods hold a resinous sweetness that might almost soothe you if your whole life were not hanging on the question of which direction to trust. Plantations were often surrounded by landscapes their enslaved workers knew in pieces through labour, errands, hunting, gathering, fishing, timber work, and visiting permitted kin. That knowledge could help. A woman might know where a creek bent, where berries grew, where a hidden footpath ran, where certain dogs barked, where a ferry crossed, where woods thickened enough for cover. Yet knowing the local landscape did not automatically solve the larger problem of distance to actual safety. That larger geography was cruelly uneven. In the upper south, some enslaved people imagined routes northward by land or river, though the journey was still perilous in the deep south. Distance itself became a kind of prison wall. To flee from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or the Carolinas toward free soil meant traversing huge stretches of hostile territory. The farther south one began, the more freedom could feel like a rumour attached to a map too large to cross. Mexico offered another direction for some fugitives in the southwest, and maritime escape existed from certain ports. But such possibilities depended on location, contacts, timing, and luck that many women did not possess. One quirky but revealing detail in some runaway advertisements is the close attention owners paid to geography based on kinship. Notices might suggest a woman would try to reach a mother on another plantation, a husband in a nearby county, or children from whom she'd been separated. That means owners understood something essential. Fugitives did not move through space randomly. They moved toward known human ties. Geography for enslaved women was emotional as well as physical. A river bend mattered because somebody lived beyond it. A town mattered because a relative might be hired there. A road mattered because it led not just away, but towards someone. That pull could save a person. It could also expose her. Searchers often guessed that a woman would head toward family, lovers, or familiar communities. The geography of affection became predictable to those who wanted to capture her. Imagine the cruelty of that. The very people who made home impossible could use your longing for home as a map back to their power. Weather added another layer. Summer heat could drain strength terrifyingly fast, especially with little water and no shelter. Winter cold in the south was less famous than northern cold, but still dangerous, especially in wet conditions. Rain erased some tracks and created others. Fog concealed but also disoriented. Storms could force a fugitive woman to seek cover in cabins or outbuildings where discovery was likely. Even moonlight was double-edged. Too little, and you stumble. Too much, and you can be seen. The land itself had a social texture too. Open fields left nowhere to hide. Forest edges offered cover but also limited sight. Bridges narrowed choice. Ferries required interaction. Towns provided anonymity, only if one could perform belonging well enough to avoid suspicion. For black women, that performance was harder because public expectations were racialized and gendered. A woman alone, especially one carrying signs of labor or distress, might invite immediate questioning. Passing as free required clothing, speech, documents, and confidence that were difficult to assemble under slavery's pressure. Some women did attempt disguise. There are scattered cases of fugitives altering dress, carrying forged passes, or using hired-out mobility and urban anonymity to move farther than owners expected. Scholars continue to debate how often women successfully use such strategies, because many successes disappeared from the record by succeeding. Failure is better documented than freedom. The archive loves capture. It is less skilled at preserving escape. Still, even without long-distance flight, local geography shaped survival strategies. Woods could hide brief truancy from abuse. Nearby marshes or ravines could shelter someone for a night. A neighbouring plantation might offer contact with kin. Market routes could carry information. Fishing spots, laundry places, and springs could become informal nodes of communication among women. The landscape was hostile, yes, but it was also read carefully by those forced to live within it. Black women learned where danger pooled and where a sliver of possibility opened. By late afternoon, the earth throws heat back upward. Your skin feels coated with dust and sweat. Cicadas whine from the trees with maddening steadiness. Somewhere beyond the fields, a wagon creaks along the lane, slow and heavy. You think about what it would mean to step off that lane and keep going with no certainty of shelter before dark, no guarantee of water, no map, no trusted stranger waiting kindly at the next bend. Geography does not care about bravery. It simply presents terms, and those terms were harsher still for women whose bodies were already worn down by labour, childbirth, illness, or injury. Chronic pain could limit speed. Untreated wounds could reopen on the road. Pregnancy transformed every mile into a negotiation with the body. Nursing mothers could suffer painfully if separated from infants or unable to rest. Menstrual bleeding without supplies complicated movement and concealment in ways rarely acknowledged in old heroic narratives. There is a whole physical history here that archives barely mention, though women surely felt every inch of it. That bodily truth is one reason no exit was simple. The plantation did not merely sit on a map, it pressed on flesh. It sent women toward flight already exhausted, already underfed, already carrying other lives in their arms or in their thoughts. Geography then magnified every weakness slavery had produced. As evening approaches, the landscape softens in appearance again. The sky turns pale gold over the fields. Frogs start up near water. The scent of mud and warm reeds rises from a creek bank. Shadows lengthen under cypress and oak. It is almost enough to make the countryside look generous. Almost. But do you know what sits inside that beauty now? Distance without safety, cover without certainty, roads without welcome, water without easy crossing. So when people ask why more black women did not simply flee southern plantations, the land itself becomes part of the answer. Not the whole answer, never that. Law, labour, family, surveillance, and violence all held their place. But geography closed its fingers too. It made escape longer, heavier, slower, and more visible. It punished the body for trying. It turned every natural feature into a question with consequences. And in the cooling hush of dusk, with the trees darkening and the roads fading into uncertain grey, you understand the bitter lesson the landscape taught over and over. Open country is not the same thing as open possibility. On a map, there may have seemed to be many ways out. Under your feet, there were precious few. You begin to see that when escape is nearly impossible, resistance does not disappear. It changes shape. It lowers its voice. It slips into gestures, delays, glances, remedies, refusals, and the stubborn management of a life someone else claims to own. On a southern plantation, black women often had very little room to run, but they still found ways to push against the system that enclosed them. Not always dramatically, not always visibly, yet often with remarkable intelligence. The morning starts in the usual way, with smoke rising faintly from the cook fire and a pale wash of light spreading over the yard. The air smells of ash, damp boards, and crushed grass underfoot. A child whines sleepily. A kettle lid clinks against iron. Somewhere in the distance, a mule stamps and snorts before the day's hauling begins. Everything looks ordinary. That is exactly what makes resistance here so easy to miss. The plantation preferred rebellion in simple categories: running away, fighting back, breaking tools. Those acts did happen, but black women also resisted in forms small enough to hide inside routine. One of the clearest examples is time. Enslaved women did not own their hours, but they could sometimes bend the pace of those hours in tiny ways. A chore took a little longer than expected. A garment was mended with practical care but no extra speed. A message was delivered after one necessary stop became two. A pot simmered as it should, but not with the urgency a mistress demanded from her chair. These acts may sound almost comically modest from a great distance, yet slavery depended on obedience not only in outcomes, but in tempo. To reclaim even a few stolen moments could matter. That is part of what makes this history so interesting. Resistance was not always loud enough to satisfy later imaginations. Sometimes it looked like preserving your own energy when the system wanted total depletion. Sometimes it looked like helping someone else rest for 10 minutes longer. Sometimes it looked like deciding that the owner's convenience would not be your personal religion. You feel the texture of that world most clearly in the work itself. A woman kneads dough while listening carefully to talk near the doorway. Another scrubs a floor, but shifts position to block a younger girl from the direct notice of a passing white man. Another ties up herbs in a corner of the cabin, not for seasoning, but for healing. Another woman in the field keeps one eye on the row and one eye on a child nearby, guiding with a hum or sharp whisper. Nothing here announces itself as revolt, yet all of it pushes against the plantation's claim to total control. Some resistance took the form of knowledge. Black women often held practical expertise that owners needed but did not fully understand. Midwifery, herbal medicine, food preservation, sewing, dairying, laundry chemistry, childcare, poultry keeping, gardening, and local environmental knowledge all gave women a certain kind of leverage, however fragile. A mistress might issue orders all day long and still depend, quietly and completely, on the woman who knew how to stop a fever from worsening, how to ease childbirth, how to keep butter from spoiling, how to stretch rations, or how to make old cloth last another season. That dependence did not create freedom. It did create opportunities. Historians still argue over how much power such knowledge granted in practice. On some plantations, women may have won minor concessions, greater mobility within the property, or moments of protected authority in matters like birth and illness. On others, owners simply exploited skill more intensively while granting nothing meaningful in return. The uncertainty reflects how uneven plantation life could be, but there is little doubt that knowledge itself became a quiet resource. It could soften suffering. It could build trust among the enslaved. It could sometimes frustrate the neat, smooth operation owners imagined for their estates. Healing knowledge was especially important. In quarters where formal medical attention might arrive late, wrongly, or with indifference, women used roots, leaves, teas, poultices, steam, and cooling applications to manage pain, stomach trouble, childbirth recovery, coughs, fevers, and minor wounds. Some remedies came from African traditions carried and adapted across generations. Others emerged from local experimentation and exchange. A quirky little detail that appears in scattered records is the importance of humble garden and yard plants, the kind of things owners often overlooked while dreaming themselves masters of the entire landscape. A weed to one person could be medicine to another. Slavery loved official authority. Black women often survived through unofficial expertise. There was also resistance in information sharing. News moved through workspaces where white people assumed only service was happening. Kitchens heard conversations. Laundry areas caught scraps of gossip. Market errands gathered rumours. Church gatherings, if permitted, could pass news more widely. Women exchanged warnings about traders, patrol activity, illness, pregnancies, punishments, and possible opportunities. The plantation tried to isolate people emotionally and geographically, but information knitted them back together where it could. This is where you begin to understand resistance as social rather than merely individual. One woman saving herself mattered. One woman helping three others mattered too. A whispered warning could prevent punishment. A shared piece of bread could preserve someone's strength. A carefully timed distraction could spare a younger girl from scrutiny. A hidden needle, a tucked-away onion, a saved scrap of cloth, a lullaby sung softly enough to calm a frightened child. All of this preserved life against a system built on wearing life down. Some acts were more direct. Tools could be mishandled. Animals could be inconveniently hard to manage. Household items could vanish into mysterious non-appearance. Food could be quietly redirected. Breakage could occur in ways that looked accidental. A milk pan cracks. A gate is not latched quite securely. Cotton sacks wear thin sooner than expected. Chickens slip into the wrong garden at the right moment. Plantation records often call such things carelessness. Sometimes that is surely what they were. Sometimes perhaps not. There is a dry little pleasure in imagining the self-serious outrage of people who claimed ownership over human beings but became incandescent over spoiled butter. Still, sabotage carried risk, especially for women whose duties were closely watched or whose children could be threatened in retaliation. That is why so much resistance had to remain deniable. Plausible accident was safer than open challenge. A woman did not need to declare rebellion to practice it. She only needed to know exactly how much disorder could pass for ordinary life. You can hear another kind of resistance in song. Not every song was secret code, despite later romantic inventions, but songs did carry emotion, memory, rhythm, humour, and sometimes veiled meaning. Singing while working could coordinate movement, ease exhaustion, or create shared feeling in places designed to isolate the self. A line altered here, a phrase stressed there, a mournful cadence turned sly. And suddenly a field or washyard held more than labour. It held interpretation. The owner might hear sound. The singers heard each other. Prayer could work in a similar way. Religious life among enslaved people was complex, shaped by African traditions, Protestant teachings, local practice, and lived suffering, for women especially. Prayer meetings and spiritual language could create spaces of dignity and collective endurance. One must be careful not to romanticize this. Faith did not erase bondage, but it could offer a language in which slavery's claims appeared temporary, wicked, and smaller than they wanted to seem. A woman kneeling on a dirt floor at night might possess no legal rights at all, and still believe, with astonishing force, that her soul remained outside the reach of any ledger. Scholars continue to disagree about how openly women could criticize owners in these spaces without inviting retaliation. The answer likely varied by plantation, by audience, and by the skill of the speaker. What matters here is that resistance often involved controlling meaning. If the plantation said you were property, any practice that insisted you were a full moral person pushed back against that lie. There was also resistance in mothering itself, though not in the sentimental way later generations sometimes frame it. Teaching a child caution, memory, naming patterns, bodily pride, or practical survival skills was not passive. It was preparation against erasure. Refusing to let a child's identity be defined entirely by the owner's claim was an act of defense. So was preserving kin ties where possible, remembering who belonged to whom, keeping alive stories of relatives sold away, and carrying names across plantations when official records did not care enough to do so. Cooking, too, could become a site of stubborn creativity. Black women built meals from limited and often poor rations, adding greens, herbs, fish, beans, sweet potatoes or wild plants, or small precious bits of meat when available. The smells drifting from cabins at dusk, smoke, cornmeal, onion, greens, fat, molasses, all tell a story not just of necessity, but of cultural persistence. To season food well in a world designed to strip pleasure away was no trivial thing. It said that survival would not be flavourless if skill could prevent it. One unusual detail from plantation life is how often textile work carried hidden meanings. Women repaired clothing, pieced quilts, braided hair, wrapped infants, folded away garments, and handled fabric constantly. Cloth marked status, age, gender, labour, and care. While many later myths about secret quilt codes remain unproven, there is no doubt that textile labour allowed women to preserve beauty, dignity, and household order where the system offered very little of any. A patched dress made wearable again. A child wrapped warmly, a head wrap tied with precision. These were modest acts, but they shaped how people moved through the day. Sometimes endurance needs beauty more than historians admit, of course. Resistance could also involve open refusal in moments when the body or spirit reached a limit. Women argued, cursed under their breath, struck back, ran temporarily, hid in woods, or resisted assault physically. Some endured punishment for it. Some died. Some vanished from the records at precisely the point where their lives became too inconvenient to describe. We should not imagine all resistance as graceful or subtle. Anger belonged here too. So did desperation. So did the fierce and deeply human decision that enough was enough, even when consequences were severe. By late afternoon, the heat presses low and heavy over the quarters. Sweat dries rough on your skin. Dust clings to the edge of your skirt. Somewhere nearby, a baby laughs unexpectedly, a bright sound that cuts through the tired air like a small miracle. In another cabin, a woman crushes leaves in a bowl with the back of a spoon. In the yard, someone shakes out laundry with a sharp snapping motion. Every one of these gestures exists inside the plantation's design. Not every one of them belongs to it. That distinction matters. Slavery wanted total possession. Resistance often began with refusing that totality. A body could be owned in law and still withhold parts of itself. A mind could observe, judge, mock, remember, and plan. A pair of hands forced into labour could still choose whom to comfort first. A woman denied the road could still shape the world within her reach so that it leaned, even slightly, toward life rather than domination. As evening settles, the sky turns smoky pink and then deeper blue above the trees. Frogs begin in the wet places beyond the cabins. The smell of supper rises, humble and warm. Voices drift low through the yard, not carefree, but alive with exchange. This is not freedom. It would be false to pretend otherwise. Yet neither is it pure submission. It is something harder to categorize, and therefore harder for oppressive systems to erase. It is endurance sharpened into action. So when you think about black women on southern plantations, you must hold more than the image of those who fled. You must also hold the women who resisted without leaving, who carved out pockets of agency in kitchens, quarters, gardens, birthing rooms, wash spaces, prayer circles, and fields. The plantation tried to narrow their options until movement itself became nearly impossible. They answered by making resistance mobile in another sense, carrying it in memory, skill, humour, care, secrecy, and the steady refusal to let the slaveholder define the whole meaning of their lives. You might think the plantation becomes easier to understand once you learn its routines. Dawn bell, field rose, kitchen smoke, evening weariness. The mind likes a pattern because patterns promise explanation. But the lives of black women under slavery were often made more unstable, not less. By movement they did not choose. A woman could be kept on one plantation for years and still never feel settled. She could be sent away for weeks, months, or forever. She could be hired out, loaned, mortgaged, inherited, sold privately, sold publicly, or shifted between properties owned by the same family as casually as a chair moved into another room. Under slavery, displacement was not an interruption of the system. It was one of its favourite methods. You feel the unease of that truth in the sound of wheels first. A wagon coming up the lane has a particular weight to it, a slow wooden rattle that can mean supplies, visitors, traders, or trouble. Horses snort in the heat. Harness leather creaks. Dust rises and hangs in the air with the dry smell of road and animal sweat. People in the quarters glance up, then glance away. Nobody wants to stare too long at a wagon that might carry away a life. Sale was the most obvious form of forced movement, and one of the most feared. A woman could be sold because an owner needed cash, because an estate was being divided, because a marriage joined properties, because a debt had ripened into crisis, because someone found her difficult, or because the market favoured her age and skills. None of these reasons had anything to do with what she wanted. That is worth pausing over. In a free world, relocation can be stressful. Under slavery, it could be annihilating. The new place might be harsher. The work might be heavier. The people might be crueler. The family left behind might never be seen again. For black women, sale carried a special terror because it reached through every role they held at once. A labourer lost familiar routines, a mother lost children or feared losing them, a wife lost a partner, a daughter lost elders, a healer lost the community that trusted her. A woman in domestic service lost even the small habits that helped her avoid danger in a known household. Every survival skill built around one place had to be reassembled in another, if there was time to reassemble it at all. This is one reason advertisements and account books can feel so cold when you read between their lines. They list age, colour, health, talents, temperament, perhaps whether a woman is a good cook, washer, field hand, nurse, spinner, seamstress, or house servant. Those traits were marketable. They increased value. But what the record does not say is equally important. It does not say who she comforted at night. It does not say which child knew the sound of her footsteps. It does not say who might be waiting by the lane for one last glimpse as the wagon leaves. Market language translated a full person into profitable fragments. The domestic slave trade magnified this violence enormously. As cotton expanded in the 19th century, Enslaved people were sold from older slave states into newer plantation regions at staggering scale. Women were part of that forced migration, whether marched south in coffles, transported by ship, or moved in smaller private sales. Historians still debate the precise emotional and demographic effects on particular regions and kin networks, because records track transactions more neatly than feelings, but there is no uncertainty about the broad result. Countless families were broken or thinned by long-distance sale, and then there was hiring out, which could be less final than sale but still deeply destabilizing. An owner might hire a woman to another household, business, town residence, or plantation for a season or a year. This practice allowed owners to profit from labour without relinquishing ownership. For the woman herself, it could mean entering an unfamiliar space where rules, dangers, and expectations had to be learned at once. A skilled cook might be hired to a boarding house, a washerwoman might be sent to town, a nurse might serve in another household, a seamstress might work where she knew no one, slept in a corner room, and returned only occasionally, if at all. Hiring out is sometimes treated as a sign of flexibility in the system, as though mobility itself were a kind of advantage. That is a very comfortable misunderstanding. Mobility without control is not freedom. It is just displacement with extra errands. Still, hiring out could create contradictions the plantation did not fully control. A woman hired into town might meet more people, hear more news, or gain brief access to small earnings. Depending on local arrangements, she might learn streets, faces, routines, and possibilities that plantation isolation had hidden from her. She might also face intensified vulnerability, especially if sleeping away from kin or working in households where no familiar women could shield her. Exposure and opportunity often arrive together. You can imagine the sensory shift of such movement. One day the smell of pine woods and cotton dust, another day the sharper scent of town, horse manure, chimney smoke, stale beer near taverns, fish at the market, river mud near the landing. The ear changes too. Instead of mostly plantation sounds, you hear carts, vendors, church bells, hammering from workshops, white people arguing over business, sailors laughing too loudly, children racing down alleys. For a hired-out woman, the wider world might feel tantalizingly close and still entirely unreachable. Some women were moved not because they were sold to strangers, but because the same owner controlled several properties or parceled labour among family members. A daughter marrying into another plantation family might receive enslaved women as part of her dowry or household setup. A widowed relative might request help and be sent one or two women from the main estate. A son starting his own farm might be given labourers from his father's holdings. Imagine being transferred as though your whole life fit inside the phrase "send her over for a while." Ownership made casual language possible. That casualness had consequences. Every move severed routines that women relied on for safety. A known overseer, however brutal, had predictable habits. A familiar mistress had moods that could be read. Neighbours in the quarters could be trusted, or at least understood. Local paths, springs, cabins, woods, and kin ties formed a map of practical survival. Transfer erased that map overnight. The woman arriving at a new place did not yet know who might warn her, who might harm her, where children slept, which dogs barked, where the creek cut deep, where food might be hidden, or how quickly punishment came. Displacement stripped knowledge from the body. One curious detail in some records is how often women were valued for adaptability itself. Advertisements might praise a woman as handy, capable, accustomed to household work, suitable for town or country, useful with children, livestock, dairy, or needlework. This sounds almost complimentary until you remember what it means. Her versatility made her easier to uproot. The more jobs she could do, the more places she could be profitable, and the less any buyer needed to care about what she was losing in the move. Mothers faced especially cruel choices under these conditions. A woman might be sold with a nursing infant but without older children. She might be sold away from all her children if they were deemed separately marketable. She might be hired out and forced to leave children in the care of others for long stretches. She might watch adolescent daughters edge towards saleable age and understand what that meant before anyone said it aloud. The dread could begin years before the event. Childhood itself was shadowed by market calculation. Some owners claimed they avoided separating young children from mothers, and there were cases where practical concerns made them keep mothers and infants together temporarily. But even this should not be mistaken for mercy. It was often economics dressed up as sentiment. A nursing infant needed the mother. A mother burdened by grief might work less efficiently. A very young child could be difficult to sell at a high price alone. Plantation paternalism loved to appear humane right at the point where profit happened to align with minimal decency. Scholars continue to debate how often enslaved women could influence where they were hired or with whom they were sold, especially in urban areas where labour arrangements were more varied. In a few cases, women seem to have bargained for placement near family or in familiar households. More often, their preferences mattered only when convenient to owners. The evidence is patchy because many negotiations were informal, coercive, or left undocumented. What remains clear is that the final authority rarely belonged to the woman whose life was being rearranged, and yet women did adapt, because adaptation was demanded by survival. A newly arrived woman might quickly assess which white person held real household power, which enslaved person knew the place best, which child talked too much, which task offered a little solitude, which outbuilding stored food, which path led toward neighbours, which hours left room for whispered talk. She might begin building trust with other women through shared work, shared grief, or exchanged practical help. She might conceal parts of herself until she knew the ground under her feet. New settings required a new reading of danger. The emotional burden of repeated displacement could be immense. To lose one home place, even a home place inside bondage, was painful enough. To lose several over time could produce a life of permanent unsettlement. You stop fully unpacking your hope. You guard your attachments because any attachment may be broken. You remember names and directions because memory becomes one of the few ways to keep a family whole when geography does not. Some women likely carried entire kin maps in their minds, repeating them inwardly against the plantation's effort to scatter everyone into forgetfulness. By late afternoon, the sun tilts low, and the wagon in the lane casts a long slant shadow across the yard. Dust tastes bitter on the tongue. Sweat dries on the neck in a faint, salty crust. Somewhere behind the cabins, a child laughs, unaware of how fragile every arrangement is. Near the big house, someone calls for water. Horses shake their bridles with a bright metallic clink. The ordinary day continues, but under it runs a deep current of uncertainty. Who will still be here next week? Whose child will wake to an empty sleeping place? Whose husband will stand at the edge of the yard looking toward the road long after the wagon has gone? Forced movement also made escape harder in another way. A woman recently sold or transferred had fewer local ties, less knowledge of the terrain, and more reason to fear capture in an unfamiliar region. A hired-out woman might know the streets of a town better than the countryside around it. A woman moved into the deep south from an upper south county might lose all sense of where any potential refuge lay. Each displacement reset the geography of hope. It did not erase the desire for freedom, but it often made acting on that desire more dangerous. There is also the wearying fact that being moved repeatedly could teach a cruel lesson. Not every departure leads to liberty. Some departures lead only to another owner, another kitchen, another field, another locked routine with different faces. The road itself becomes ambiguous. Is movement, rescue, punishment, profit, or all three at once? When your whole life has taught you that motion can mean loss, it becomes harder to trust movement, even when freedom may be somewhere at the far end of it. As evening deepens, the plantation settles into that deceptive quiet it does so well. Frogs call from the low ground, smoke drifts from the cabins, sweet and sharp. The wheels on the wagon finally still. Somewhere a woman folds a child into her arms with unusual firmness, as though touch could anchor what law refuses to protect. And in that fading light, you understand that slavery did not need to keep black women in one place to keep them trapped. Often the trap was movement itself, movement commanded by others, movement that shattered family, stripped familiarity, and kept a person too uprooted to gather force. So when you picture southern plantations, do not imagine only fixed rows and fixed lives. Imagine also the churn beneath the surface, Women sent, lent, hired, inherited, sold. Women learning new kitchens, new paths, new dangers, new names to trust or fear. Women carrying memory like contraband because it was the only thing the wagon could not fully seize. There was no safety in being left where you were. There was no safety in being moved. That was the genius of the system. If one can use such an ugly word for such an ugly design, it made instability itself into a form of captivity. You come at last to the paper trail, which is a strange place to stand after so much dust, sweat, smoke, and fear. Plantations loved paper. Bills of sale, inventories, punishment notes, crop tallies, letters, estate divisions, advertisements, passes, account books, insurance claims, medical charges, tax records. The slave South had a great appetite for ink whenever ink could protect property. But when it came to black women's inner lives, private strategies, failed departures, temporary disappearances, hidden griefs, and unrecorded acts of refusal, the archive suddenly grows thin, evasive, forgetful. It is almost as if the people who built the system did not care to preserve evidence of the humanity they were trying to own. That is why the records can mislead you if you read them too literally. Silence on the page is not silence in lived experience. An absent notation is not an absent event. If a ledger does not mention a woman trying to flee, that does not prove she never tried. If a planter's diary reports a hand as lazy, difficult, or troublesome, it may be recording resistance in the only language he allowed himself to recognize. If a sale inventory lists children without emotional comment, the tears are still there. They simply never made it into the handwriting. You can almost hear the scratch of a pen in a quiet office while outside the yard smells of horse sweat and trampled dirt. A clerk dips his nib, straightens the page, and transforms a life into neat lines. Female, age 26, good field hand, has one child. Sound. That little word sound tells you nearly everything about the moral condition of the writer, and almost nothing about the woman herself. Is she grieving? Is she exhausted? Did she bury a child last year? Did she flee for 3 nights and get dragged back? Does she know herbs, songs, river paths, birthing techniques, local kin maps? The page does not care. This is where black women often disappear twice, first into slavery itself, then into records built by enslavers. Runaway advertisements are one of the sources historians use most carefully, and for good reason. They reveal names, ages, skills, kin links, scars, speech patterns, and the anxieties of owners trying to recover human property. Some ads mention women directly. Others mention children travelling with them. Sometimes the language gives small clues, saying a woman may be making for a husband, a mother, a former owner, a town where she has connections, or a plantation nearby. Those details matter because they show that women did move, did plan, did imagine routes, yet advertisements also distort. They exist only when an owner chose to pay for publication, and only when the disappearance seemed worth pursuing that way. A woman who hid briefly in nearby woods might never appear in print. A woman recovered quickly might be noted only in private records. A woman whose absence was explained away as truancy, illness, or confusion might leave no trace at all. So the archive gives you fragments, not totals. Historians still argue over whether black women were underrepresented in runaway notices because they fled less often than men, because owners pursued them differently, or because women's absences were more likely to be handled locally and informally. The answer may be some mixture of all three. Men were often described as more mobile in public space, and thus more frequently imagined as classic runaways. Women, especially those with children, may have been less likely to attempt long-distance flight. Yet many women also practiced other forms of movement, temporary absence, local truancy, or concealed resistance that did not fit the dramatic category of the runaway notice. When the record favours only the most visible forms of escape, quieter forms of defiance vanish. You see the same problem in plantation journals. Owners and overseers tended to record what affected profit, order, and discipline. Illness that reduced labour might be noted, pregnancy might be noted, birth might be noted if it affected property counts, Punishment might be noted if it was severe enough or useful as precedent, but ordinary terror, whispered planning, sexual coercion, maternal dread, strategic slowness, or nights spent weighing impossible choices usually remained outside formal writing. The archive catches disruption when it inconveniences power. It rarely records the full pressure that made disruption necessary. And then there is the matter of naming. Black women were often identified incompletely, inconsistently, or by names imposed by others. A woman might appear under one name in a ledger, another in a sale record, and a diminutive or distorted version in family memory. Surnames were unstable. Ages shifted. Descriptions could be vague or patronizing. One owner's Lucy might be another's Lucinda. One clerk writes 30, another 28. A child listed without a surname becomes almost impossible to follow 10 years later. This is not just clerical inconvenience, it is a structural theft of identity. One curious detail historians sometimes use with great care is clothing description in runaway ads. Owners might note a head wrap colour, a checked dress, a bonnet, a shawl, a pair of men's shoes, or a habit of carrying a bundle. These details were meant to aid capture, but they also reveal women as self-presenting individuals, choosing, borrowing, altering, or assembling appearance within severe limits. The archive tries to trap the body and accidentally leaves behind a flicker of personality. A woman wore blue, a woman took a shawl, a woman dressed for the road. Tiny clues, tremendous emotional weight. Personal testimony helps, but it comes with its own complications. Some formerly enslaved women describe their lives later in autobiographies, interviews, or oral recollections passed through descendants. These accounts are invaluable because they center experience rather than property claims. Yet they were shaped by memory, trauma, audience, editing, interviewer bias, literacy barriers, and the politics of the moment in which they were recorded. A woman speaking decades later may emphasize some dangers and pass lightly over others. She may avoid naming sexual violence directly. She may protect the dead, protect herself, or adapt her story to listeners who are not ready to hear everything. That does not make testimony less true. It means truth arrives through human conditions, not through laboratory glass. You begin to understand that reading this history requires a special kind of attention. You must listen for what the records say, but also for what they are built not to say. A planter complains that a woman is insolent. That may mean she spoke with dignity. A mistress says a servant is deceitful. That may mean the woman guarded private information. An estate record lists children separately from their mother. That may signal a looming or completed separation. A sudden change in labour assignment may hint at punishment, pregnancy, assault, illness, or conflict that no one wrote plainly. The paper is full of half-shadows. Scholars continue to debate how far interpretation should go in reading these shadows. Some urge restraint, warning against placing modern assumptions into sparse records. Others argue that excessive restraint simply reproduces the archive's original violence by accepting enslavers' silences as neutral. It is a serious debate, and an important one. But there is broad agreement on at least this much. The archive of slavery is not an innocent storehouse. It was produced inside a regime of domination. That means absence itself can be meaningful. Even numbers can deceive. If fewer women than men appear in a set of runaway notices, that might suggest lower rates of escape attempts. It might also reflect the fact that women's labour was more tightly tied to childcare or domestic service, making temporary absences harder to classify. It might reflect owners believing local recapture was likely enough not to advertise. It might reflect different thresholds for what counted as worth reporting. Quantitative history can illuminate patterns, but it cannot carry the full emotional and practical texture of bondage on its own. Statistics are helpful. They are not merciful. The smell of old paper is not strong enough to cover the world behind it. You can still imagine the hot yard outside, laundry steam drifting, mud drying on hems, babies crying, kettles rattling, cicadas whining from the trees. Every line in a ledger floats above actual bodies moving through air and heat. That contrast matters because archival distance can make slavery seem cleaner than it was. It was never clean. It was intimate, noisy, damp, hungry, repetitive, and often improvised. Records flatten what lived experience thickened. Another reason black women's flight can disappear from the archive is that communities sometimes protected secrecy well. A short absence explained cleverly, a return before dawn, a nearby refuge, a trusted network, all might leave little written evidence. Success could erase traces, so could fear. Women had excellent reasons not to speak openly after failed attempts, especially if children or kin remained vulnerable. Silence could be strategy, not surrender. The archive often mistakes survival behaviour for historical absence. There is also the issue of genre. Different records preserve different truths. Legal documents are cold but precise in certain ways. Letters are personal but self-serving. Advertisements are detailed but hostile. Testimonies are rich but shaped by memory. Church records may preserve family ties imperfectly. Medical accounts may reveal injury without cause. Newspapers love sensational flight and ignore daily resistance. To reconstruct black women's lives, historians must braid these sources together carefully, allowing one to challenge another. No single document type can bear the whole weight. That work becomes especially important when considering sexual violence and coercion. These are among the least directly recorded realities in many plantation archives. A pregnancy appears, a birth appears, a mixed-race child appears, a mistress complains bitterly, a woman is sold unexpectedly, a domestic servant is transferred. A silence falls over the page. Historians have to decide how responsibly to connect these dots without inventing certainty where certainty does not exist. It is delicate work, necessary work too, because refusing to infer anything at all can become its own form of denial. By late afternoon, the reading room in your imagination grows stuffy. Dust motes drift in warm light. Paper edges rasp softly under careful fingers. Outside, the day still belongs to the same old southern heat. Somewhere far away from the archive, in the world these papers came from, a woman is hurrying across a yard with a child on her hip and 1,000 things left unwritten. That imagined distance reminds you that history is not only what survives, it is also what was lived beyond preservation. A great many black women almost certainly left too faint a documentary footprint for any historian to fully recover. Their names are partial, their roots unknown, their acts of refusal uncatalogued, their losses uncounted except in the private chambers of memory that died with them. This is painful to admit, but it is also honest. Not every life can be reconstructed in detail. The archive is powerful, and it is damaged, yet damaged is not empty. From fragments, patterns still emerge. You can see women labouring across household and field. You can see mothers caught in economic and emotional traps. You can see displacement through sale and hiring out. You can see owners worrying about kin networks and local ties. You can see punishments for insolence, absences, or disorder. You can see enough to know that any simple story about passive endurance is false. The records may miss much, but they do not support the fantasy that black women accepted bondage quietly. Quite the opposite. The very need to monitor, classify, advertise, threaten, and explain them suggest a population in motion mentally, socially, and sometimes physically. As evening deepens, the image of the archive fades and another kind of record takes its place. Less formal, but no less real. Memory spoken between generations. A family story about a woman who vanished for 3 days. A name preserved in a Bible margin. A local tale of a midwife who knew every path through the low woods. A recollection of someone sold south. Someone who came back once. Someone who never did. These are fragile records, but they matter because they remind you that history does not live only in official custody. So when you ask why the plantation archive often seems not to show black women escaping, resisting, or even fully existing, the answer lies partly in the design of the archive itself. It was made to secure ownership, not to illuminate the interior lives of the owned. It recorded value, not dignity. It counted bodies, not bonds. It preserved disruption when profit suffered, but rarely cared to describe the long daily pressures that made women desperate, strategic, and brave in the first place, and that is the quiet lesson waiting in the paper stacks. What the records miss is not proof of absence. It is evidence of a world in which black women's humanity was so threatening to slave power that it had to be minimized even on the page. Their lives exceed the documents. Their choices exceed the ledgers. Their silences, read carefully, speak. You stand in the quiet just before dawn, when the plantation seems to hesitate for a moment between sleep and command. The cabins are dark shapes against a paling sky. Smoke from last night's fire still lingers low, faint and bitter. A hen rustles in the dust. Somewhere a child turns in sleep and lets out a soft little sigh. The air is cool enough to feel almost forgiving. Almost. Then the day begins to gather itself, and you remember that on a southern plantation even the gentlest hour can belong to a brutal order. By now, the hardest truth is clear. Black women often had almost no escape from these places, not because they lacked courage, not because they failed to imagine freedom, and not because they accepted the system that held them. They had no easy exit because the plantation pressed on every part of life at once. It held the body through labour. It held the family through threat. It held movement through surveillance. It held desire through distance. It held memory through sale and displacement. It held vulnerability through intimate violence. The trap was not one chain, it was many, crossing over one another until even breathing room felt rationed, and yet, for all that, black women were not defeated in the way the system intended. That matters. It matters because slavery wanted more than obedience. It wanted transformation. It wanted a person to become a tool, a womb, a labouring shape, a number, a role, an asset, a pair of hands without a private self behind them. It wanted the woman in the field, in the kitchen, in the washyard, in the birthing room, in the cabin doorway, to forget that her life belonged morally to her. It wanted the people around her to forget it too. A regime of that kind does not settle for control alone. It wants to colonize meaning, but meaning is stubborn. Human beings keep making it, even under pressure. You see this in the smallest details. A mother choosing a name with care. A woman tying her head wrap neatly before stepping into a day that offers her no dignity unless she creates it herself. Another saving a crust of bread for someone weaker. Another passing on the story of kin who are sold away, so that loss does not slide into erasure. Another standing between danger and a younger girl with a calm face and a racing heart. Another laughing once, sharply, at the absurd vanity of the people who claim mastery over everyone and still cannot keep their own tempers in order. Such moments do not abolish slavery. They do something quieter and, in their own way, just as important. They deny slavery the final word about who these women were. This is the part history sometimes misses when it looks too eagerly for dramatic escape and too little at durable survival. To survive with one's mind still capable of judgment, care, sarcasm, memory, and love is not a small thing in a system designed to grind all of those away. Black women on southern plantations practiced a kind of daily authorship over their own humanity. They did not control the plot imposed on them, but they kept writing themselves into it with choices, gestures, loyalties, skills, and interior strength that no ledger could fully seize. You hear that strength in sound as much as in action. The low murmur of women talking while the fire catches, the rhythm of work songs floating over a field, the soft instruction given to a child learning how to move safely through danger, the rustle of skirts in the yard, the scrape of a chair or stool across a cabin floor as someone makes room for another tired body near the fire. Ordinary sounds, yes, but they belong to a living social world, not to property. The plantation wanted productivity. What it kept producing, despite itself, was community. Community is one of the great counters to the plantation's logic. Slavery depended on fragmentation, divide people by age, sex, skill, colour, location, household role, saleability, and nearness to power. Isolate women with impossible burdens, force them to spend their strength on mere endurance, encourage mistrust, reward information, break families if necessary. That was the design. Yet black women kept gathering life back together. They did it through caregiving, warning, feeding, mourning, praying, healing, stitching, singing, remembering, and when possible, loving with great stubbornness in a world that tried to make love too risky to sustain. There is scholarly uncertainty here too, and it is worth holding gently. Historians still debate how much emotional room enslaved women had to shape communities under such intense strain, especially where sale, violence, and overwork were constant. Some emphasize the enormous damage done to kinship and trust. Others stress the resilience of family making and social repair. Both perspectives illuminate the same difficult truth. Community under slavery was real, but it was never secure. That does not diminish it. It makes it more remarkable. And then there is memory. One of the few possessions the plantation could never entirely regulate. A woman might not be able to save a daughter from sale. She might still keep that daughter's name alive in the mouths of siblings. She might not be able to travel to a mother on another plantation. She might still preserve the route in her mind, the creek bend, the stand of trees, the colour of the yard, the habit of the household dog. She might not be able to prevent a child from entering labour young. She might still place into that child's hands a recipe, a prayer, a warning, a way of carrying the self that says you come from people who knew more than they were allowed to say aloud. That private and communal memory matters because slavery was always trying to flatten time. Every day was supposed to serve the owner's need. Yesterday mattered only as precedent. Tomorrow mattered only as profit. Black women insisted, by remembering, that life had other dimensions. There had been kin before this owner. There would be children after him. There were names older than his control. There were meanings larger than his fields. You sense it in the atmosphere of evening on the plantation, when labour slackens just enough for inwardness to return. Smoke rises fragrant from the cabins. Cornmeal thickens in a pot. A baby's hair smells faintly of milk and ash. Frogs called from some hidden wet place beyond the tree line. A woman rubs sore hands together and watches the dark gather. In such moments, a person might review the day, measure the risks ahead, think of the dead, imagine the missing, and quietly place herself inside a history bigger than the one forced upon her. That act of inward placement is difficult to prove on paper. It is no less real for that. One revealing detail in many recollections is how often women are remembered by what they knew how to do. Not just work in the narrow economic sense, but heal a cough, settle a frightened child, cook from almost nothing, dress a wound, deliver a baby. Remember kin. Sing the old tune correctly. Judge whether by smell, make cloth hold longer, calm a room, or steady a grieving person. Such skills became a form of social authority, even where the law recognized none. The plantation measured labour, the community measured reliability, knowledge, and heart. That distinction gives you a more honest way to think about power. Legal power and moral power are not the same thing. Slaveholders had the first, backed by law and violence. Black women often cultivated the second, backed by necessity and trust. Moral power could not stop a sale, cancel a whipping, or unlock a gate, but it could shape the daily life of a community. It could determine who was sought in crisis, who carried wisdom, who preserved children, who remembered the lost, who helped the living stay human. Under conditions of unfreedom, that kind of power is easy to undervalue. It should not be. This is also why the phrase "no escape" must be handled carefully. It is true in the literal, structural sense. Southern plantations were built to leave black women with almost no clear route out, but if the phrase is used carelessly, it can sound as if there was no motion at all, no thought, no agency, no interior refusal, no world beyond the owner's reach. That would be another kind of distortion. A woman may have had no safe road off the plantation, and still maintained an inner life the plantation could not govern fully. She may have been unable to flee and still protected others, shaped memory, practiced covert resistance, and judged the system with perfect clarity. Constraint is real. So is consciousness. The heat rises steadily now as the day advances. Dust warms in the yard. Soap and steam drift from the wash area. Someone calls for water. A child laughs once, then is hushed. A baby squirms against a tired shoulder. A woman in the doorway narrows her eyes against the sun, taking in the shape of the day before stepping into it. You notice the firmness in her posture, not triumphant, not theatrical, simply present. Slavery could demand labour. It could not manufacture consent in the soul merely by ordering the body around. There is a temptation, when speaking of suffering this deep, either to romanticize endurance or to turn it into pure tragedy. Both temptations should be resisted. Black women were neither magical reservoirs of endless strength, nor passive symbols crushed flat by history. They were people, tired people, angry people, loving people, strategic people, grieving people, funny people, frightened people, stubborn people. Some hoped fervently, some grew numb, some resisted openly, some hid it, some protected children, some could not. Some survived long enough to see emancipation, some did not. History becomes more respectful when it allows complexity to rest where it belongs. Scholars continue to argue over how best to describe this complexity without turning resilience into a flattering myth. That caution is wise. To say black women endured is not to say the burden was fair. To say they built community is not to say the plantation failed to wound them deeply. To say they survived is not to forget those who died, broke, vanished, or were forever altered by what they were forced to bear. Yet to speak only of victimhood would also falsify the record. These women lived under crushing conditions and still made choices that affected others in profound ways. Holding both truths at once is the least history can do for them. As the afternoon leans toward evening, the light begins to soften, the hard white glare on the yard eases into gold, shadows lengthen under the trees, the smell of earth changes as heat slowly loosens its grip. In that calmer air, you can almost feel the plantation trying again to look peaceful, to present itself as a settled world of labour, hierarchy, and natural order. But you know better. You know what it took to keep that appearance in place. Threat, paperwork, exhaustion, patrols, sale, assault, surveillance, coercion, and all the rest. And you know something else too. The order was never as complete as it wished to seem. There were always minds inside it refusing the lie. So when you think of why black women had no escape from southern plantations, the answer is not simply that the system was strong. It is that the system was comprehensive, reaching into work, family, sexuality, space, law, and time itself. It closed exits not by one method, but by many. And when you think of what that means for the women themselves, you must not stop at the image of entrapment. You must also see endurance without surrender of self, memory without archives, care under duress, wit under domination, and a deeply human insistence that one's life means more than the role assigned by violence. Now the evening fully settles. Crickets begin their steady music. Firelight warms the cabin walls in flickering amber. The smell of smoke turns softer, sweeter. A child finally sleeps. A woman sits down for a moment on a rough threshold and lets the dark gather gently around her. Her hands are worn, her body is tired, her mind is still moving, still measuring, still remembering. The plantation has taken much. It has not taken everything. And that is where the truth comes to rest. Black women often could not escape southern plantations in the literal sense, but neither were they contained entirely by them. Their labour fed a system. Their humanity exceeded it. Let the night grow quieter now. Let the sounds of the yard drift farther away. The wagon wheels are still. The frogs continue in the low wet grass. A breeze moves through the trees with a soft hush, carrying the faint scent of pine, wood smoke, and cooling earth. In the cabins, voices drop to murmurs, then to silence, then to the peaceful rhythm of breathing. The fields beyond the dark seem to loosen their hold for a few hours, as if even the land must rest from the burden placed upon it. Above, the sky opens wide and patient, scattered with stars that ask nothing and promise nothing, yet somehow make the night feel larger than the plantation below. You can imagine the tired bodies settling into blankets, children tucked close, hands unclenching by degrees, thoughts slowing at last from worry into something softer. Here in the darkness, the hard edges blur, the fences fade, the road disappears, the commands of the day lose their sharpness. What remains is the quiet fact of human presence, steady and warm against the vast cool air. So you stay there a moment, in that gentler stillness, and let the history loosen its grip just enough for rest. The fire sinks low. The voices are gone. The night holds everything carefully, and at last it is safe to sleep.